Three, two, one. Perfect. Yeah, all right, we'll get into this. Welcome to another episode of This American Negro. This American Negro is a podcast meant to bridge academia and hood because I do believe that information should be accessible to everybody. If this is your first time here, my name is Marquis Davon, 1/4 of Dear Reading, This American Negro, but don't ever call me Mark because that is not my name. No offense, Mark. Very much so in the script, and I'm just like,
that's so funny. That's actually so funny.
But yeah, so that is who I am. I am an educator in the Philadelphia area, working primarily with high school students and in the after-school space to bridge hip-hop culture and putting that into the classroom. Social media strategist on the outside. There we go. Words, I can use them. Right. And if you want to support this here podcast, you can sign up as a patron on patreon.com/This American Negro. You can make a commitment of little as $2 a month, which is $24 a year, to help this here podcast because it is not cheap to run a podcast. You got streaming platforms, you got advertising, got to do all this extra stuff to make it like a good experience for you overall. But we are in the midst of Rona. So if you cannot support this podcast monetarily, there are other ways to support this here podcast through liking and sharing this podcast, letting me know when you're listening to it, teaching your aunties and your uncles how to listen to a podcast because they think it's a radio, but it's not a radio. We don't have FCC policy, so we're pretty good over here. But yeah, teach people how to do it. And feel free to leave 5 stars if you so choose to do. 4 stars is okay, but 5 stars is even better. And a comment on Apple Podcast as well. And also you can utilize the now listening hashtag, which is poddin, that's PODIN. So that way you can let other Black podcasters in the Black community know that you are listening to this here podcast. So once again, thank you for joining me for another week. Appreciate all of those who have listened so far to my Malcolm X episode. It was really cool to just sit down and just geek out a little bit over this person that I admire and who informs a lot of how I navigate this space in terms of Black liberation, masculinity, also just talking to people and making sure I can radically love myself as a Black person. So thank you to those who are engaging with that content and those who are learning from that content. Also, shout out to my students that have been listening to it too. They learned something new and I was like, ooh, this is lit. Doing my job. So all that shit is out of the way. Mark, where'd you go, man? Where'd you go? Is he still here? Can you hear me, man? Mark.
I'm so sorry about that. I have a quick glasses change because my glasses were playing games, so I had to switch my glasses a moment. I'm so sorry.
Freaking up.
It was that needed to have happened just now.
I understand. I'm all the way here for it.
I was like, okay, he's giving the intro right now. I'm gonna like pop out real quick, change the glasses, run back, and then you stopped, and I fell. I literally fell, like as I was going to get it. So yeah, but I'm here now.
All the way here for that. And the little comments that y'all have been hearing throughout the show. We have a wonderful guest today. I normally get to see him through game nights on Saturdays. Met him through one of our good friends, Jazz. So shout out to Jazz for introducing us. Gang. It's actually, what's it been, a few months? We met in October.
Was it? Yeah, we met in October.
Yeah, Jazz's birthday.
Her birthday party.
Yeah, there we go. Gang. So I'm gonna let him introduce himself. I think he's an awesome mind. Every time we have a conversation or just talk in general, he always brings a different nuance or a different perspective from it, which I tend to appreciate a lot more. So without further ado, I'm Quise. The guy I'm introducing is Mark, so it's okay to call him Mark. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Mark?
Sure, no problem. Hey everyone, it's really good to be here. Thank you to Marquis for having me. My name is Marc Williams Jr. I am the Director for Access, Equity, and Inclusion Programs at Bard High School, Early College, Manhattan, where I'm also a health teacher. Marquis told me, think about like what should I say in terms of who I am. I am a Gemini. I'm gonna start there. Yeah, I'm just put that out on the table.
Oh, that's right. I keep forgetting you're a Gemini. You're
Yeah,
such like an odd Gemini.
it is. And it is that time of the year where we.
Oh, you're really about to come alive. It's your season.
Yes, yes, it is. It is my season, in fact. So it feels good. I'm excited here to be on a podcast at 11 in the morning on a Saturday. Yeah, so I got a lot of energy. I got a lot of energy these days.
I'm actually cracking up. You're really coming alive this season. Wow. Well, I'm glad I got to start the season off with this Saturday off with the Gemini to start off Gemini season.
And as my good friend Jasmine George would let me know 2 years ago while we were interviewing students for our school so they could get in, and she looked at my co-star, and this was the first time I'd ever learned about co-star. I have like 4 or 5 like just straight Gemini symbols. I'm a super duper Gemini, apparently.
Oh, you're a Gemini through and through.
Yes, I'm not one of the psychotic ones, though. I Well, she said her first words to me was actually, "Oh wow, you're fucking psychotic." That's exactly what she said to me, and it was very funny. I promise you, I'm not one of those Geminis. I typically think those are the May Geminis, but which are still like are my people. But I'm a June Gemini. I'm in the middle.
June what?
June 15th. So.
Oh, okay. We'll bang with you. I bang with you so far. The Virgo in me is not going to judge you too harshly.
It's fine. It comes with the territory. Every Gemini knows how to deal with hatred.
Yeah, something like that. Anyways. No, but like I said, I'm excited to have you, Gemini and all. Excited to just sit down and have this conversation because you recently had a talk just to kind of talk about exploring Black male identity and the stories that we're telling, and you use it through the lens of Ta-Nehisi Coates, Kendrick Lamar, and Kenya Barris.
Yes.
Correct? And also storytelling through Barry Jenkins, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, the talk that I'd given quite recently, actually, was on Wednesday, was essentially about the ways in which Black men, not Black men as a kind of example, but really, talking about Black life generally, and even something that can be applied for other POCs if they, think of the nuance and stuff like that. Essentially, I was talking about the focus that is placed heavily on racism as a visceral body experience, right? In the sense that individuals, when we talk about racism and the ways in which we talk about racism, I find right now focuses quite a lot of attention on the destruction of Black bodies.
Right.
And I often find that particular lens, I think, is something that we need to think through a particular class framework as well. Because for me, as part of the course, as part of a required course at our school, students have to take this class called Sophomore Seminar. They read a lot of like modernist theory, Marx, all that good, Freud, Darwin.
That's really dope.
And then they read a lot of postmodern and kind of new theoretical, pieces of work and literature that are great in their own respect. And so I had suggested this year that our students read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And I was guest lecturing in one of my colleagues' class, and as students were reading, I was introducing them to a lot of theory in Afro-pessimism, various things like that. And so this really came out of this kind of moment where I was speaking to a lot of these students, and the school is diverse, so the class is particularly diverse. A lot of POC students, a lot of Black students, a lot of white students, and we're sitting here and everyone is just talking about this bodily destruction. And I started to realize that as I was reading the book, that I didn't experience like that experience of bodily destruction. I actually don't feel as close a proximity to, which is not to say that I am not in proximity to it, but the intimacy with violence and towards that kind of destruction that Coates really was talking about. I struggled with the idea that he kept talking to his son only about this particular kind of racism.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, he actually defines racism. I don't think it was an intentional for him, or maybe it was. I shouldn't say that actually. But he has a passage where he talks about racism, and he says that racism is, it's like back breaking. It's teeth knocking out. It's brains getting blown to bits. That kind of, like, he uses that very visceral language.
Right.
And I question in the talk that I gave, and for the paper that I wrote, I questioned this focus and reliance on narratives of Black bodily destruction, and I contrast that against our kind of non-focus on the kind of insidious forms of racism, the ways in which it actually creates precarious bodies and surreal experiences for people that actually last, I argue, may last longer, perhaps, than those violent bodily destructions.
Yeah, and that's actually one of my critiques of Ta-Nehisi when I engage with a lot of his work, because there is almost this kind of distancing that he has when it comes to that conversation a lot of the time. And when I look at it, it always feels like, I call it the Chicago effect. I don't know if that's a real thing, but it's like a lot of people can tell you about Chicago without ever really experiencing Chicago, and they think that that's the truth. Like, it's this crime-ridden area, there's a lot of violence here, and that's what Blackness is supposed to look like. That's what racism is supposed to look like. This is what violence is supposed to look like towards the Black body. And sometimes when I look at the way that Ta-Nehisi addresses some of these things in terms of race, I think he's a wonderful mind, but there's also like that distance of, like, when I engage with his work, it almost feels like a middle upper class Black person telling me about my experience. And I was just like, I'm poor. Sorry, that's how I grew up. Like, my class was not something I could relate to.
It's actually quite funny you say that, because the talk, I delivered it as a letter written to my future son.
Oh, so I like how you twisted how he did that.
So I wrote it as a letter towards my future son, and essentially I was very honest. I was very vulnerable, and I told my future son. I said, reading this book was very weird because in many regards, Ta-Nehisi's son is growing up, has grown up, will continue to grow up the same way I imagine my son will grow up, as an upper middle class Black individual.
Right.
And I understood where he came from in terms of his experience. And in the talk, I say I'm not invalidating his particular experience growing up in the streets of Baltimore during the crack epidemic or anything like that. But it is interesting. It was interesting, and I was infuriated quite a lot when reading the book, because he just kept talking to his son, which I understood. He kept talking to his son about this, like, the possibility of bodily destruction, but it was so pessimistic to the point of, like, I questioned if it was even maybe the only thing he should have been talking about in relation to racism to his son, when his son is going to have a great deal of proximity from the kind of violence that he himself had faced growing up. And so in the letter to my son, I said, son, you're going to grow up, pretty well, right? You're gonna grow up like your father did. You're not gonna grow up like your grandfather did, who is now like a wonderful upper middle class, Black man, but is from Jamaica. Like, he was impoverished. He did not have all of the wonderful things that, like, the kind of luxuries that we can afford and engage with now. But that doesn't mean that your class status exempts you from feeling the effects of racism. And here's how you will feel that. And so I did a lot of I drew from what Ta-Nehisi had done, and I drew on experiences that I myself had faced. And two big things that came up for me had to do with the fact that, one, and so in the talk I say, like, this is not going to be comfortable, because I really wanted to engage this notion of the fact that a lot of particular violence that I faced in my life have actually been at the hands, most violent acts, every single violent act that I've faced in my life has been at the hands of a Black person.
Right.
And I was like, having to reconcile that particular fact with narratives that are out there that are validating but not all encompassing is something that's very tricky, because people don't necessarily move through these things with nuance and stuff like that. And so I was really making a nuanced argument that on the one hand, I have to, in the like, quite actually, in the world that I live in the body I inhabit, the violence I tend to have to worry for my own, right? And that was when I was mugged on a train, or when I had to stab a man because he tried to rob me, like, like all sorts of things. Or like
Right.
me and my family beating people up in the streets because like,
Look, I get that.
right, this kind, like, I grew up in Canarsie and I grew up in Jamaica, Queens. Like, I might be able to read Foucault and Plato and all sorts of things, but like, these hands can easily.
Like, don't let this degree fool you.
Right, don't let this fool you.
Don't let this book fool you right now. Like,
Exactly. Like, don't let this kind of intellectualism fool you. Like, we will square up and you will lose this fight. And so I was trying to, like, tell him, like, yes, I have to, like, I've lived my life so far dealing with that particular fact, but also dealing with this very surreal experience of living in a country that knows it's racist history. Like, most people, I would say, like, agree, like, yes, racism is a thing. Some people might say it was a thing. Obama made people think that.
Post-racial,
right, and all that good stuff. And it wasn't so much that, like, Ta-Nehisi for me stops with the fact that America has a racist legacy, and the heritage of that is this bodily destruction. I push that point further. I say it's not that entirely. That is a thing that is true. It is also the fact that we live in a society where there are people who recognize this heritage, aka non-white individuals, and they are trying to do that. Like, they are trying to not be racist. And it's very weird and it's surreal when you live in a world where you have people who recognize racism, are trying to do something about it, but who themselves are also saying that they are inherently racist, right? Because this is the kind of performance of whiteness, right? Or rather of a certain kind of white liberal, for example,
right.
or a certain kind of white moderate, the individual who's just like, yeah, like, I have privilege. I do this thing. Like, you know the song dance. I have privilege. I have the third.
It's like an interesting, like, flip on this double consciousness that white people have to inhabit. So it's like, I know I benefit from these things, but while I'm also benefiting them, I can also participate at the exact same time. And sometimes I tend to have that conversation in terms of colorism. Like, it's very hard to reconcile, like, I am oppressed. There is also, in this very same system that oppresses me, you benefit from due to white supremacy. Like, there's still white supremacy that benefits Black people. And I put up air quotes for those who are not watching this but listening to it.
Right.
And so I think it's like a very fascinating thing, because we have to acknowledge the duality that lives. Like, are you always going to get it right? Probably not. Unlearning stuff that's been ingrained in you for so long, and also unlearning the environment that you grew up in at the same time. Like, I think that's also another factor that plays into it, which is why I think it's, like, very fascinating when you talk about Ta-Nehisi's experience, and also you put Kenya Barris's experience in that as well, because we get into the space of trying to define Blackness, but in doing so, are we saying there's a very particular Black experience that validates this? So when we talk about the backlash that BlackAF got, but also when you're telling that particular story, are we negating the ability to imagine a world where we are these rich Black people? Or are we also just saying that's a very particular Black experience that's the exception to the rule to where the rest of us are at? And is it okay for us to acknowledge that without feeling like we're being a detriment, or can't have the audacity to imagine this world?
I absolutely see what you're saying. And so in the talk, what I do is I talk about this moment where I'm sitting down, actually right here. I'm sitting right here when in this memory where it happens, and I'm reading the book to prep for the classes that I'm about to go and lecture in, and I see the commercial for BlackAF. It's the part that caught me. That was like, yes, I need to watch this, is when one of the producers, when he's on that FaceTime call with a bunch of Black icons, in film.
Love that scene.
And then one of the producers says, Blackish, like, he's like, be real with me. He's like, you're fine. Blackish taps into the hearts and minds of 55-year-old white women. And I make the argument that Between the World and Me is not only for people of Coates's particular, upbringing and stuff like that, but also for this group of white individuals who seek to understand the Black condition and who seek to get it, and I'm saying that in air quotes, to understand it in air quotes, to help with it in air quotes, right? And because it's convincing. And so, the theoretical side of this is that Ta-Nehisi Coates makes a very intense ontological argument, right? He's saying that what it means to be Black is, in America at least, involves this commitment to viewing the world as ultimately against you and also trying to destroy you, right? The world is trying to destroy your Black body, which is a commitment that I don't necessarily subscribe to, right? But I understand the logic. I fully understand the logic. And I think that the logic is important there. My issue is that if you make a total commitment to it, you actually start to erase Black experiences that are not in proximity to that particular kind of violence or in proximity to that. And I told him that I didn't tell him this, I wrote it, and I was like, what stands between what stands between this is actually a kind of a class barrier, right? It can be many kinds of barriers. If just sex barriers could count in that as well. And so I was sitting here, and that comes on, and then it's hashtag black as fuck. Hashtag, yeah. And I was just like, this show is about to do the thing. It's about to do the nuance. It's about to do that nuance that I want Ta-Nehisi's son and my son to understand. But it's gonna do it in a very satirical way. Right. And I knew immediately when I saw that trailer that this show was going to be so polarizing, precisely because it's not trying to make, and the argument that I make about it is that it's not trying to make a total commitment to the other end, right? The other opposite end of this like ontological commitment to Black conditions as being destructive, or not as being destructive, but as being prone to total destruction. It's trying to actually poke fun at what it means to live in a society where you have to deal with that particular idea that's floating around, but also you got to deal with this white gaze, right? Like this white gaze, and like dealing with money, and actually like what happens when your class status changes your proximity to various ideas and elements of Black life. And now you have to navigate a kind of Black existence while still trying to like stay true to something that
which is
condition.
Right, which I think is like super fascinating too, because he does this in both of his formats. He does this in BlackIsh, and he also does this in BlackAF. So BlackIsh, it takes it on that very much so of him, instead of him breaking that fourth wall and talking to the audience in BlackAF, in BlackIsh, it's him talking to his kids, because there's still a specific part of him that wants to know, like, I came from this, but also essentially experiencing socioeconomic shock. Like, you are now in a new class, and you now have to navigate your Blackness in a different way. So your struggles will not be the same. And we can talk about this theory, like this kind of theme that happened. We watched it in A Raisin in the Sun, right? Like going into this new neighborhood, which is not where you're used to. You're faced with, back in the day, it was like much more overt racism, but now you're faced with like these new things that you have to layer on. If just like, now are my people going to invalidate my Blackness because I have now got there? So am I going to be seen as a sellout? But then it's also like, how do I maintain my roots as my tree gets higher and higher in terms of socioeconomic status? And I think that's the part that is like tugging at a lot, because now, how long does it take for you to be so far removed where you no longer understand what it's like to live in these conditions that white supremacy essentially set for us, and now we have to experience this day to day, whereas yours is a lot more like, and my kids don't experience that same kind of Blackness that you have, like, and that's fine.
And that thing, and I talk about that in what Barris does in this show, is actually show us what I think the condition of Black existence, particularly Black male existence, tends to be, is that the body is often, the feeling of the body, the kind of phenomenological experience that, like, what if we had to write what the experience of being actually is, I would say that it's actually precarious, right? And that degree of precariousness is gonna is going to move depending on your proximity to violence or whatever, wherever
Right.
it's at stake. But it's surreal. And so I'm telling my son in this letter that he needs to really watch out for those very surreal moments that are not going to maybe strike you instantaneously as racist, but
Yes.
like over time you're going to realize that like there are these moments, these like of your story that really have fucked with you in a way, right? Like, and so I talk about a recurring dream that I have about an experience that I had when I was a teaching fellow, in a for a laboratory program, right? I was teaching a class on infectious diseases, and I was the only Black guy on this team of mostly white women and one non-binary white individual. Supervisors were all white. Most of the faculty were pretty white. And there was only one other Black person there, another Black woman, who happened at the time to be in the same major as me. And so like I thought we had this like really cool thing. But ultimately, like, it was such a piss poor experience because I was treated like shit at every point, right? In ways that were surreal. It wasn't this kind of like covert thing. It was this very like the director had taken a keen interest in my development. So that's what I mean, right? It's like I had this white woman who is, if you asked her, she would say she's not racist, right? As I think many white people would say. They would take great pains to say that they're not racist. Yeah, they were like, have I maybe said something inappropriate or something like that? Yes, I'm learning, right? One of the kind of good white liberal,
well-intentioned,
white liberal. And so she was the kind of person who took a very keen interest in my character development. So everything that happened was always this kind of like, this is for your own good. I'm helping you out here, da 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 da. When in fact, she, one time I had to go get groceries. Like I was told could you go pick this thing up from this place? And it turns out it was it was groceries. And I was like, no one else would have been asked to do this. I said that, we should, there was a problem with something and I gave a really great suggestion for how to fix it. And I was kind of written off. And then in a meeting, my, a white woman, one of my colleagues who was great, she said the same thing. And the people who had told me no were just like, yeah, amazing. And my face, I was just like, wait, what a minute. And so like the director looked at me and then she was like, literally in front of this meeting, she was like, is there a problem? You shouldn't look so smug, right? Like that kind of thing. Or when she told me that, I needed to be more of a man of commitment after I had missed a talk for a speaker who I'd escorted throughout and had been with the entire day, and who told me that her talk that she was given was basically going to be our conversation. I missed the talk because I made a commitment to pick up my best friend from the airport, right? And she had berated me in her office, and when I left the office space, a bunch of the faculty were there for that program, and they had heard what had happened. And these would be people who would also call themselves well-intentioned white liberals who saw abuse, heard abuse, and said nothing about it. And this was, Hudson Valley in January, it's cold, Catskill breeze is, got me sniffing, like I'm crying in my room, like it's just awful experiences. And that really stuck with me, right? Where people were like, you're not that good of a teacher. And I felt betrayed by one of my own because she had made this like zoological, experiment of me by having people kind of like look through the glass mirror as I was teaching.
Right.
I was really comfortable. I was sitting down. I had a PowerPoint. I'm going over lab safety protocols. And then I get back into the lab where the rest of my colleagues are. And this, like, another person of color was just like, were you even teaching in front of all these people? And I was just like, what do you mean was I teaching? You saw me teach. All of y'all came weirdly to this window to observe me teaching. And it was just so wild. And then I got moved, like literally I got physically moved from the building where everything where the lab was at, to a different building. And while I was in that building, like by myself doing all sorts of things, new to the program, et cetera, it was the end of the like rotation, and I cleaned up my room by myself. And then I was coming to move things back to the main building, and a bunch of the women came inside, took all of the stuff out of the room, took it back. And when I finally got to them, one of them had made a comment, didn't realize I was there, and heard it, was like, he's not even that good of a teacher. I walked through that space. They knew that I had heard that. And it was just kind of like, what? Because they looked ashamed of what they had done. That's what I'm talking about. Like those surreal experiences around where you're like, I live in a racist society, but there are well-intentioned people who are doing these really racist things. But racism, as the narration of it, as the narratives of it are going out there, makes it seem as if racism is always this visceral, violent, like antagonistic, I'm here, like, you
In
know,
your face kind of thing. And it's like them small comments that make you think like, am I crazy? Did they just,
I'm
am
the
I?
cop who pulls out the gun, da da da. And even and I actually take Ta-Nehisi to task with this, because he has this, I was like, the surrealist moment in that book, right? The first real moment where he talks about a white person actually doing something racist, like to him and his family, is when he's coming off the elevator and a white woman is like tells his son to move out the way,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in the entire book, all of the like violence, and it's like the violence is at the hands like of all the black people who he grew up with, and even his friend Prince, who when he went to Howard, who died, or who died by a police officer. Like,
Yep.
that police officer who shot Prince was black, and he talks about going back to the area and wondering like why none of the black people where this man is from are necessarily doing anything. And just when you think he's about to make that class argument to be like, oh, there might be a proximity here, he doesn't. So when I watch Black as Fuck, I'm watching it and I'm watching Kenya struggle with now in like having money and having to raise a black family and questions of manhood. And it's funny because today I'm on Instagram and I'm looking at this post, and it's basically like all of these young rappers who have like these really dope chains, like Takashi Shark chain that's like mad big, and then I think Takeoff's chain that's like the actual, it looks so dope. It has like shit. It's like NASA and whatnot, spaceship. And the first episode of BlackAF is
about his chain.
Like Kenya's characters being like, why are y'all talking about my chain? Right? He has deep comfort in this chain. And even when the white guy asks him, he's like, I'm sorry, you spent how much? Wait, that chain is 75, what now? And he's like, did anybody ask you? Like, what? And like, it's just these weird things. And he starts to think like, why do I have this chain? Like, is this for me? Who is this? But this is a part of where I'm from. But what does that say? Like, he's going over these kinds of questions, and like that dynamic that he has, right? It's funny to me because I was thinking that Black-ish stuff, it is written for the folks who will watch ABC at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday or something like that, right? Like, as far as I know, like that really ain't me, right? That's not me. I'm not that person. And even when
I love me some Black-ish. I ain't even gonna hold, like, that is
right. Like that's not, and even like when I asked like black people, like, have they watched Black-ish? You were one of the few people I know who actually watch it.
Wow, which is like super interesting because like a lot of my I enjoy it because I'm just like, this is simple stuff. Like, I really don't care. I was like, it's a modern day Black family that I enjoy seeing on television. But it's also fascinating because a lot of my students, this is also their introduction to a lot of topics. So they're all like, yo, Mr. Keith, you saw the episode of Black-ish? And I was like, absolutely. I was like, I was watching this too. Like, this is not necessarily new information to me, but I think I just personally just enjoy like the simplicity and the formulaic aspect of the show, where I'm just like, oh, okay, if this were to be some people's introduction to specific topics that they have, I'm just like, that's fine, because it's very interesting to see a Juneteenth episode on BlackAF versus the Juneteenth episode on Black-ish. And one is very much more like edutainment. Like, let me educate you and entertain you at the same time. So Black-ish's episode was a much more like musical themed and to celebrate, whereas BlackAF wasn't. And so I think that's like always like a fascinating thing. But then it's also when you make that point of, you almost have like to reflecting yourself in terms of like who Kenya is, because it's like, what does my Blackness look like? Because I remember, because that's even like relatable in terms of like why I grew out my hair. Like, it was last year at Susquehanna, and I was just tired of people saying like, I was a tour guide and was also a diversity inclusion chair for our admissions house. And it was just like, oh, like, you're very articulate, ... for a Black guy. Or I was also like the safe Black, because I cackle everywhere I go. Like, I'm just laughing all the time. So it was like interesting because there was a little bit where I was just like, am I also adhering to respectability politics? Because I came from the hood, a very low income area, and I made it to college. So I was just happy to be in that space. But then there was also that part of just like, oh, is Marquise the Black guy or the smart Black guy, or Marquise X, Y, and Z, whatever you wanted, Black something.
Exactly. Are you performing and for them, and no one ever asks you that, and they're just like, wait a minute, I wouldn't know that because I've not really thought about like how I became a person.
Right. Because most of my time, it wasn't necessarily like trying to deep dive into my blackness and all this stuff. A lot of the time, I'm just like, there was something for me spiritual and liberating about growing out my hair. So not only was it like a personal journey for me, but it was also like a little stab at the white people who were just like, oh, and even, I'm not even just white people, older Black people in my family too. Like, oh, your hair is getting a little wild. You sure you want to go out looking like that?
Yeah.
You should get a Caesar. And I'm just like, nah, I have a very specific relationship to my hair now. And so, yeah, even then when you bring up the chain episode, I'm even thinking back to that moment where I was just like, I'm making this active decision to grow my hair out in turn, to rebel against these white people who think, and older Black people who think less of me because of this not being a clean-cut, safe image for them, which I think is fascinating. So I appreciate you adding that perspective on the chain.
That's what I mean. Is like that show gets written off quite easily, but it is actually such a nuanced discussion.
I say it's just getting written off easy because I'm just like, all these light braids, like,
Right, no,
that's not my story.
In fact, like, and that's, it was weird because it immediately got written off precisely because it says #BlackAF, which feels definitive, right? But no one actually is like, I'm thinking about that podcast I was listening to that you were on.
Mm-hmm.
And quite honestly, like, I was so infuriated with some of the panelists.
Same.
I was totally infuriated.
There was like, and because I was starting to get like uncomfortable on it because I was like, I feel like there's something classist about the language that they're using. Extremely classist, because I'm just like, would you want like the Black ghetto girl, or do you want somebody who's like up to do? And it was still essentially saying I'm performing for whiteness to still be respected in the way that everybody should be respected, which is why I was just like, no, because right after this panel, I know I'm going to get onto that Savage remix and start fucking shit up. Like that, there's a duality that we live there where I'm just like.
And two people had not watched it and were making commentary about it, and we're talking like it's really easy, like and that's the thing. And Black is like, Kenya Barris, like, it was weird to me when individuals on that podcast, for example, were talking about how like this really ain't Black AF, and even the person who was leading Salah, I think. Yeah, even him, I was like, but your point about like this, the name, you found the name to be problematic. In fact, like the reason you find the name to be problematic is exactly the point Kenya is trying to make here, right? It's like, what do you actually think it means to be Black AF? Because honestly, any Black person that uses that hashtag is in fact Black AF, because ultimately us trying to define what it means to be Black cannot ever be definitive. It has to be encompassing of
right.
different kinds of Blackness that exist.
And how it starts to manifest too, because we can also, like, we always want to argue not every Black people are not a monolith. Black people are not a monolith. But then there's also that little bit where I'm just like, Black people are not a monolith, but there is this collective thing, system, structure, power structure that we all have to fight against. So there is something where it still reminds you, still nigga at the end of the day. But even like my sophomore and junior year roommate, Rob, like, he's a little bit more well off than I am. So there are moments where I'm just like, I can't relate to you because you come from a 2-parent household who's a little bit more well off and you live in the burbs. I said, I'm in a single parent household, 4 siblings, and I had to work since I've been 16. Like, as soon as I had to figure it out, I had to figure out like, oh, this is a different situation. So there are moments where I'm just like, there are things that we do not necessarily relate to. I said, and I also like broke it down like this. I said, there's a reason that you gravitate towards Chance the Rapper and who else? Whatever other, Childish Gambino and those rappers. Like, those are very much so, I always say they're like the uppity Black rappers or white people's favorite rappers. Like, that's not situations I can relate to because that's not the reality that I personally live. So I thought it was like always fascinating to kind of see like, one, how we ingested music and digested music, but then 2 was finding this common ground in our Blackness, but also realizing like we have 2 very, very particular experiences.
Right. Exactly. And that nuance that happens, right? And like at one point, like I just asked myself, like, and you can ask Jadzia. I texted Jadzia. I was like, honestly, can someone just tell like I was thinking of 3 people. I was like, can someone honestly just tell these people that like, the real problem here is that you have an issue, which I understand with like seeing light-skinned individuals, like light-skinned Black individuals, and your idea of Blackness is about dark skin, and that's really what it is. Like that's really
we
like
tie dark skin to masculinity, and that's what we associate Blackness
exactly.
with.
Like that's what the problem here is that like people, like certain Black individuals' proximity to lightness, right? Like their light skinned things actually for you doesn't make them Black, right? Like for many people, and this is true, and it's something like we actually need to be far more open about and really nuanced about, is that for many Black individuals, right? And I've done this, I felt this, you know, I've certainly unlearned that. It's kind of like you do in fact kind of judge, you give them the brown paper bag test. Like you do it in ways where you're like, are you Black enough? Like how Black is this person?
Like I tell everybody, I said, are you like J. Cole Black or are you like Logic Black?
Exactly,
like,
right? And it's
I'm not really sure.
Right, and it's like you can be those different kinds of Blacks, but we just need to recognize that those are different kinds of Blacks, and they're like proximities aside to like how, you know, what kind of Black that is to your Black. As the wonderful line goes, still nigga, right? Like it's still,
right.
Like that's what it is, and we can talk about like what those lifestyles like look like. But I was telling my parents, I was like, you know, it's interesting to me because one of the reasons, like honestly, one of the reasons I don't watch Blackish, I watch Grownish, which
I love me some Grownish.
I have my own thoughts about. We can come on another podcast about that.
Look.
But I watch like I watched Blackish and I really tried to get into it. Like season 1, like I was like, yeah, like spent through. I really tried to get into it. And I was just like, I feel like this is a safe version of upper middle class Black life.
Oh, it's Blacksplaining all the way.
It's like that it's palpable for white audiences, but could still like, you know, engage because of that edutainment. Like we see ourselves on primetime television, like
right.
Doing this kind of thing. But at the end of the day, I was just like, my mom isn't a doctor and my dad is not like the head of the division. Like that's actually still well off the ways. But at the same time, I'm just like, I'm still an upper middle class Black and we're still quite successful. So we're like, so where's like our particular representation? Like, I was like, my dad is not like that. Like we don't do Juneteenth. Like where's the like we're crazy. And then I saw BlackAF and I was like, that right there. We are certainly nowhere near in proximity to like that kind of wealth.
Right.
But the ways in which like they interact with each other, I'm just like, absolutely. Like my parents, like we all talk to each other like that. Like absolutely. Like,
which is so fascinating because I was like, that is not in my household. Let me tell you, not in my mom's house.
Right, like my sister is literally that. Like my sister owns it. I was cracking up. My sister owns, you know, a wig business. Like she is running this wig business and everything like that. So when Kenya opened the phone and was like, what is up with your hair? Like, did you know this? That's literally my sister when she got red hair, when she got orange hair, right? She's fabulous. She loved Fashion Nova. And he did this whole thing about like, then you got to go to like this website if they don't have it. And she was like, I felt that. And I was like, you see, this is us, guys. Like,
yeah. So I think that's interesting because I still feel as if like, I mean, besides the grandparents, because Jennifer Lewis and Lawrence Fishburne really be having me crying. Like,
they are hilarious. Grandparents are hilarious.
Grandparents make the show for me, and Marseille Martin, because she makes the show.
It's like Marseille Martin reminds me of my little cousin.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And there's this character on the show, but like I don't have those grandparents. My grandparents are Caribbean.
Right.
Very different. Very different.
Right. And I think that's like the interesting part on how we like navigate all of this space. Because in theory, like you would think I would be able to kind of relate to BlackAF a little bit more because my family, 2 younger siblings, Black and white. Me, Black and Puerto Rican. 2 older siblings, Black, white, and Puerto Rican. Like 3 different dads, all shades of Black in my family. But there was still part of it where I was just like, from an imagery standpoint, is something I always argue with people. It's just like this, it makes sense in the space that they're in because more times than not, it is a light-skinned family or mixed family because their proximity to whiteness and their acceptance of that, who is normally going to be in these spaces. So we see this a lot, whether it's pop stars, when we see this a lot in terms of actors, we see this a lot in terms of who gets those opportunities. We can list out every single way in which dark-skinned Black people are not going to be in these spaces because of certain systems, because of specific ideologies that Black people subscribe to, but also whiteness tries to like pressure us onto. So I do think it's like a very fascinating conversation because I have yet to actually see like my family on screen. and my particular Black experience. Oftentimes these people who are in these spaces, it does turn into Black-splaining a lot of the time. Like all of the Ish series is Black-splaining. The times where I do see things that are not Black-splaining, which is why I have more of a preference on seeing, like, the first time I saw a little bit of my family on TV was 2 weeks ago on Insecure. I think that was the Thanksgiving episode.
Insecure, like exactly. I'm just like, see, and that brings me to another point of watching all of this is like, what you say is absolutely right. When we watch a show that is about Black life, we have to accept from before we enter that show, right? We have to accept that the depiction of Black life in this show is resonating with Black people. It might not be our degree of Black people. Mm-hmm. We might see certain things and it's like, I can understand, I get it. It's not my particular Black life.
Right.
Elements, not for me, right? Like, I get that. I totally can get that. But when we write Black narratives off because they don't conform to our own proximity to our Black life, that's when I tend to find, I'm like, okay, this is what this show is actually trying to talk about, right? It's like this nuance. So this is, and for me, this is like ultimately when I think about why I enjoy BlackAF more than I like Blackish, it's because Blackish could never do episode 5.
Not at all. Not the fuck at all. Episode 5, besides Tyler Perry's part, I thoroughly enjoyed.
So it's interesting because that whole episode I thoroughly enjoyed, but I especially loved Tyler Perry's part.
I actually hated it because I was just like, understanding Tyler Perry as an entirety, from a creative standpoint, super serve your audience. Do what you need to do. Get that. Awesome. But from a critique standpoint, he is deeply problematic for me. So I will always say, like, in order for art to grow, we have to challenge. In order for more nuanced characters to appear, we have to challenge. Something that I've seen just from a creative and art standpoint and studying theater, he does not ever advance these characters or provide more nuance to the characters that Tyler Perry produces.
I agree.
Very much so, like, this is it. This angry Black woman, Mammy. Here's a light-skinned savior. Here's a dark-skinned evil guy. Here is the gay person secretly who ruined the entire family. And so there are things where I'm just like, you're not necessarily advancing a particular narrative or a particular experience, but this is something that of our aunties and uncles very much so ascribe to. And so for me, when I see him in a modern day context and him talking about fuck what the critics say, it's not him talking to just white critics. He said fuck what Black critics have to say. It doesn't matter. And so that's the part where I'm just like, we should be able to still challenge. Though critique is there to see us grow, agitate, and advance as a society. And we're not advancing, his work is not advancing us. I think Insecure and Atlanta work, even BlackAF in some degree work, because these things are not, we have the show Atlanta Insecure, shows that happen to be Black. There are nuances in that show that are very much so like meant for us to see, and we'll get that kind of humor. It's like me right now watching this Rami show. There are jokes being made in that show that I'll never understand because I do not have a particular Muslim experience. Right. Like, I don't know all the nuances that go out into it, but it forces me to do homework. So I think it's always like interesting to see who we tend to invite into these spaces and who we're essentially writing for in these spaces. Like, I know Issa Rae is writing for niggas, point blank period. She's not writing for white people to have to experience this. So I think it's always interesting in that nuance, because we're in the space of being woke and wanting to make sure we catch on all these Twitter timeline talking points, but also at the same time, are you just doing things that Black people will get? Like, a lot of us, we're enjoying the fact that we saw Kyla Pratt because she's Black famous. Like, that's very much so, like, that's our person. Like, we know her, we grew up with her, we love her.
Exactly. And, so that episode, everything you said is exactly that episode. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's so funny because it's like, Tyler, I do not like Tyler Perry's movies. I don't like his movies. I watched the plays and I was like, I liked the plays when I was younger, and I like saw it and I was like, this is hilarious. Medea is funny. Yes, I can't wait for her to shoot someone. This is so
because he is a playwright. He's not, I don't think he should just stick to playwriting. His shows are still written like a playwright.
Like, literally, actually, I was like Tyler Perry. Like, well, what's that saying? It's like Tyler Perry, like walked so you girls could run. Like, in like playwriting, like I would go so far as to say every major Black playwright today has Tyler Perry to thank for paving this particular way.
Do not disrespect August Wilson ever like that in your life.
August,
original.
I have no idea. I have no idea who August Wilson is.
You ever see Fences?
I'm not counting them out.
Oh, okay, I was about to say because August Wilson is the OG who broke a lot, and that's just because he was also my dissertation. So I was just like, let's know our history.
It's certainly your field, but I guarantee you, if I go and ask my parents and my aunts and everyone in my family, I say, who's the only Black playwright you know? The only person they're going to tell you is Tyler Perry. And right, so for them, it's like that's their
it's
thing.
The popular person that I can cling on to.
Like absolutely. Like, do I think Twilight Los Angeles changed the game, right? Mm-hmm. Like Anne DeVere Smith, like all these people definitely. But there's a certain kind of thing that Tyler Perry has done for certain Black playwrights that I can appreciate. But these movies, like, what is this movie? This movie was crazy, and it's the last Tyler Perry movie I ever watched intentionally, and it was because I was listening to the read, and
I'm crying. Is it How Taraji Get Off the Boat?
How Taraji Get Off the Boat. How she got off the boat. Because I was driving and I'm listening to this episode. I was like, I need to go watch this because this sounds so crazy. Tyler Perry really, somebody gave this man too much creative license because this sounds so crazy. And I watched this movie and the whole, just especially from public album, like the whole AIDS line, I was just like, what? I was like, what is happening? What is happening here? This is crazy. But also at the same time, like part of that younger me who watched, I'm just like, I can't stop watching this. This is crazy.
Oh my God. Once quarantine started, me and my roommate watched Medea's family funeral or some shit like that. And I was just like, this movie is dumb, but it's so funny and I can't stop watching it.
Exactly.
It's like there's certain appeals about it where I'm just like, why am I suffering through this? Because I think it is still trash, but I think there's a bit of superficiality that I enjoy about Tyler Perry, where I'm just like, I don't think too much.
Black characters, and it's like everyone knows this because have you seen Dear White People?
Yeah.
Right. So like Dear White People, like they do that scene that show that plays all the time, and then finally that professor comes.
It's a show within a show.
Exactly. I'm like, this is definitely supposed to be like Tyler Perry and Shonda Rhimes, like to some extent. Like I get it here. Shonda does a much better job, I find, but like
very much so.
So much so. But when Tyler Perry in that scene where he's just like, I'm talking to a certain group of people, and that's what I'm doing because that I like you don't think I know, like fuck the critics, the Black ones too, like da-da-da-da. He's like, you just gotta go out and do these things, and like you do what you do, you make your money, you stay true to what you know, to yourself, to your craft, to your form. And it's like even fuck whoever doesn't like it. He was like, do you think I care if like y'all don't like this thing? He was like, I know who likes it. And I'm like, he's right. My aunties will gladly still go and buy the Tyler Perry box set. Like they'll still do it, and they know like absolutely because they're still seeing these particular tropes like in their lives, like elsewhere. They're like that he's speaking to them. I'm over here just like I am so far in proximity to it. I know it because I grew up as a Black person. Like you're not like I osmosed it into me. Like, you know?
And that's the part that's just like wild to me because I'm just like, in what world, like, and we always deal with this as Black people who get into like create like thought leader space or leadership space. Like, is there still an obligation for us to worry about our ethics through and through? And that conversation where he's like, it's making me my money, it's doing what it needs to do. I tweeted this probably like, months ago I tweeted this and was just like, I was like, capitalism is the reason that creatives cannot fully expand their work because once they find a specific niche, capitalism will tell them keep replicating that in order to continue to keep this job, in order to continue to feed these people so you can keep this check. And that's the part that kills me sometimes because I do also recognize that like some of my students who are dark skinned, they're just like, I won't be able to attain this certain level because that person up in that space does not look like me at all. So understanding like imagery and media still plays a role in this. So if I, like for me, I was like, I never saw a dark skinned Black man cry on TV. Like until I saw This Is Us and was like, wow, Randall, you're really crying here. Like, you're doing this for all of us right now. But I think that's another part that I think is like super fascinating, because it's like your ethics are now out of the way, but you're still playing this game that you think you need to play. But it's like Steve Harvey has no reason to keep appeasing white people, but he does. Tyler Perry has no reason to keep appeasing white people, but he does. And so I think it's like very interesting, and there's a sense of irresponsibility that I place on people like Steve Harvey and Tyler Perry, because I'm just like, I don't want my kids to grow up still thinking dark skin is not right, or dark skin means you have to stay in this particular area. So I think that's always going to be that duality of just like, you want them to experience something more, but if their first introduction, and we know that media and peers tend to play more of a role than like your parents sometimes in terms of your development, I go back and forth, because I'm just like, fuck, like, you keep making your money, do whatever, but also me, ethic-wise, I can't necessarily get behind that more, because I do understand the damage that you're still doing, whether you intentionally doing it or not, which is where I think my issue was with his idea on critique.
And
that's what that was.
I've tried watching Curb Your Enthusiasm.
It doesn't do it for me. I also don't like The Office, so I guess that is also a reason that show didn't do it with me.
I love The Office. I have a very odd sense of humor, I guess. Like, I love The Office. I'm still not quite into like Curb Your Enthusiasm, but I love Veep. I love the show Veep. Like, Veep I want to see a black version of Veep. Like, I want to see the Obama version of Veep. Like, I want to see that, right? So watching BlackAF, I was just like, this is actually so hilarious. I've never seen this. I've never seen this framework, in a blackety black lens, right? I've never seen this framework. This is actually so hilarious to me, because if this, I was like, this is so, it's like, I'm like, this is great. And it's funny because in a lot of ways, the show actually sets up a wonderful defense for itself, because it's like, even if you think the show is mediocre, even if you think it's bad, the fact that this show exists is still such a milestone, and it is still so deeply important for artistic form, for textual form, for analysis of Black life. Like, and that whole episode is about what is the space for Black mediocrity, but even more so, right? Like, not everything that in fact that is Black is excellent, right?
And I can't wait for us to get to a space that's okay. But it's still funny, because there's still that part where we're just like, no, you have to still.
Everything has to be excellent. If it's Black, everything has to be excellent. And it's like, it doesn't. And so to have Tyler Perry there, because he says, he's like, do you think I know that everything I know? Like, I do. Obviously not all of it is good. Like, he definitely knows that. Tyler he knows it. At the end of the day, though, this man is running one of the largest, like,
the largest production studio.
What? Like, there's a reason he's like sticking to doing what he's doing. And so, but that's complicated. It's like BlackAF to me, like, we're having this podcast.
Yeah.
Like, it did what it needed to do. It did what it needed to do. But this is the podcast I wanted to listen to that one time where I was listening to the podcast about BlackAF. I was just like, y'all clearly didn't take episode 5 seriously. And
I think the strongest parts of that season was episode 5 through 8, because it felt more organic. It felt like it wasn't forced. It felt like it found its footing.
It did. And I agree with that. Like, it's like, I absolutely, like, the show is not like closed off from critique. I agree. The first, the 4th episode, like, there were a lot of things that I had missed, even though I was paying quite.
It was too busy in certain times where I'm just like, you're playing with a lot of stuff, and I'm just like, slow down. Silence and space to breathe works in this format, but you're not allowing it to, because it's almost like that uncomfortability of like, all right, I'm trying this new thing, and let me put a bunch of ideas in there, and then by the end of it, where we start to see them kind of disintegrate in their relationship with each other, that's the part where I was just like,
and he talked about that in a interview. He was like, you can write at Netflix, like, they give you such creator, you can do what you want, right? But many Netflix shows, he's like, you can write yourself into like out of a contract, right? Because your show, like, it just or whatever, like
Right.
you did too much because you have so much creative license, and you can kind of see that a little bit. And so like it requires, like, I don't know if it's intentional in a way, but it does require some rewatching. And if that is intentional, I think there's a way to get that maybe doesn't have to have you like work as much as you have to by episode 5. Like, it kept me still engaged. I thought it was funny.
Oh, I thought that shit was boring. I did not pay attention to it for the first 4 episodes.
Like,
I did not pay attention. I'm just like, this is like background noise to me.
I get that because I have used it as background noise. But when I sit down, and so in a lot of ways, you know, I think for me, one of the reasons why I took to it so much is because I went through that same feeling with The Office. And I know a lot of people who have had that experience where they watch The Office. Like, it took me, I kid you not, it took me 4 years to get into The Office.
It's so
I don't know.
I keep getting judged because I don't watch it, and I'm just like, it's just not a show that does it for me.
It wasn't. I was just like, this is not funny. I was like, what the hell? I was like, this is so stupid. I was like, I'm not here for this. One day I'm writing my senior project to graduate, you know, from Bard, and The Office is on. I'm like, fuck it, let me watch it. And I don't know. I don't know.
10 episodes later.
Literally 10 episodes. I've watched The Office. I watch every episode of The Office now well over 5 times. I've watched all seasons of The Office over 5 times.
I've only ever dedicated that kind of time to either Avatar or House.
Like, and it just, because it's so absurd. It gets so absurd. It's so hilarious. Like, it's ridiculous. And I was like, this is what someone is speaking to, what it's like to work in an office space where you have these crazy personalities, and you all know, like, this shit is so weird. Like, I want them to do a version of that for school. Like, I need people to understand how surreal and crazy and ridiculous it is to work in a school, especially in times where, like, you might work in a school where people are woke or like shit like that. And just like, it's just to have that experience. So for me, you know, watching BlackAF, as I was reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, I was like, okay, these two things need to be placed in conversation with each other.
Right.
Because they are talking about Black life on very opposite extremes, but in very complementary ways.
Right.
And so that's what the talk was for me. I was like, son, it's not that, like, you can't have what Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing and you can't have BlackAF. You need to understand, I talk about what it's like to be a chameleon nigga. And to be a chameleon nigga is to take from both of these particular forms, literary and, you know, and artistic, and to actually think through the ways in which they allow you to navigate the proximity that you will have to the violent destruction of Black bodies that is America's heritage, but also that surreal experience should you actually, you know, make it in the American dream sense, but have to still contend with the fact that you reside in a Black body. And that even if your Black body is light, you still have to deal with some very racist shit. Even if your Black body has money and can afford proximity to violence and heritage and legacy and stave it all, you too still have to deal with the surreal effects that racism lingers on your mind. And that's why, you know, in the talk I say, there's a reason every single episode has to do with slavery, like it's titled about slavery, but that every episode is not really about slavery. And you know, and actually, Marquise, I'm going to push you, go back and rewatch that Juneteenth episode. Like, go back and watch that Juneteenth episode, because I realized actually that everything in this show is way more connected than I even realized on the second watch. Like, on the third watch, like, and someone in the podcast talked about this, their problem with the cookout that they had.
There was no dark-skinned person at that cookout. I was sad about that.
Right.
That was the only thing where I was just like, now y'all know y'all got them niggas, because we make fun of. Come on, you little light bright, bring your high yellow ass over here.
Exactly. The whole thing where they're just like they're having that cookout, and it's the first cookout that they're having. It never occurred to me, like, it didn't really hit me that they had a second cookout. and that the second cookout looked much like what I've experienced and everything like that. That first one it looked to me, it was like whenever I got to go to a party with older people and they're all white and I got to like navigate that space
Right.
or host it. And that second one, it came full circle because there's a scene, there are parallel scenes where in that first cookout, everyone's white and you realize that they have to assimilate and be chameleons in a way. And he has to be that dad and like do that nonsense with the team and everything. But there's a moment where him and Joya are kind of like looking around, or I think he's looking around. He's just like, what? It's so quick. It happens so quick.
Yeah.
And then in the Black Cookout episode for Juneteenth, where he's staring at this painting, he's just like, all of this. Right, he like doesn't quite get the painting. At the very end, the artist is there to explain it.
Yep.
But at the cookout, there's a moment where him and Joya look comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
They're just like, yeah, this is
this is us. This makes sense.
And it happens in those like that span of the first 3 episodes, but they don't really talk to each other directly. But you're just like rewatching it. I was like, it's subtle, and it's nuance. There's a lot when you get through the noise and his pacing. He's not that good of an actor. He leans into it finally.
I actually thoroughly enjoyed him. I thought he was.
I thought he was not that good in the first go around, and then I realized I was like, let me just accept it. And I was like, I fucking love this.
Set your expectations of what he's supposed to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, which I think I can definitely appreciate in terms of this conversation as a whole, because it's not only examining a space of what Blackness looks like when you add class into it, when you add this new kind of notoriety into it. And the last part of what I wanted to talk about a little bit is like the fact that you also reference like Kendrick Lamar and you also reference Moonlight, which I think is like super fascinating. I'm not familiar with the fifth text that you talked about. But in that, I think it's also like very fascinating in terms of Kendrick Lamar's trajectory, because it took it till Damn for them to say, oh shit, this is a Pulitzer Prize thing. The rap is journalism. This is how we can see an insight to Blackness, and that's not even something that he was doing. I think the album that became the most popular and poppy for everybody to digest is definitely Damn. So it was fascinating seeing that they validated that before they validated Good Kid, M.A.A.D City or To Pimp a Butterfly, which is my personal favorite. And I'm just like, it's interesting to see how that works, but then also navigating the dupeness that happened with Moonlight and just figuring out like, all right, they were supposed to win this, but as you see these characters, these people, Kendrick as like a real person and talking about his experiences, but then we look at the characters within Moonlight, and these are characters where we're not necessarily explaining shit. There are just nuances that we get.
Right.
We know, we experience, a very particular Black person experiences, because I think those two, plus the two that we just talked about for the majority of this episode, are very much so two different experiences, but there's this weird lens of whiteness that connects them in terms of validation, what we see, what we want to accept, and what we don't, because I don't think Kendrick makes it pretty for people.
He doesn't.
Moonlight doesn't make it pretty for people.
Exactly. And so at the talk, I wasn't able, because when I wrote the piece that I wrote, it's going in for publication, but I'm still working on it and stuff like that.
Love to see it.
But when I wrote it out, I was just like, okay, you've written something that's actually quite amazing here. Don't overdo it. And so I didn't actually in the talk or in the paper write about the suggested readings and reviews. Or I didn't actually, and I know in the talk, it's just like, I do talk about Lamar, but I actually ended up not talking about Kendrick formally in the paper. But a student had asked the question is like, if you had more time or if you'd wanted to like to talk about that, what would you have said about Kendrick in this particular conversation? And exactly what you said is exactly what I had said.
Oh,
right? I was literally just like,
right.
everyone focuses a lot, like, or not everyone, I should say, but there was that whiplash to really start focusing was when he got nominated, when he won the Pulitzer Prize. And, I was like, you are looking at refined Kendrick. Right? That is a Kendrick who is like figured out, yes, this is the man, right? Like you want to talk about that, like that uncut, raw, just like really dealing with some shit, Kendrick. And you can see that actual, he's dealing with in real time, moving from that reckless adolescent boy in Good
Mm-hmm.
City to this very like I am operating on multiple levels, and
Yep.
he's moving through class status. He is navigating. He is
Talks about all of that.
you are seeing that development of Black manhood through these particular albums. But I told everyone, really focus on Good Mad City, like really focus there, because he taught like those voicemails. People don't listen to those voicemails on that album. People don't realize when he, when Homeboy is like, yo, we going into the city, we out here just like
Mm-hmm.
living in the streets. Like Coates writes in his book, he says, who knew that from that violence and danger could essentially billow up like fog from a boyish afternoon.
Right.
And that's literally Kendrick's whole, like the whole discography
The
is
whole thing
is boyish afternoons, and he's realizing, and it's a subtle. He's not like, it's not a song where he's just like, yeah, I'm awful. No, he is doing some real nuanced like analysis of what it means, what it meant, and what it means to grow up and develop as a young Black man who is moving away from his proximity
Yep.
to violence, that thing that Coates is just discussing, to that kind of that area where Barris is at, right?
Which is so fascinating, because we're seeing that like Good Kid, Mad City, that literally is like, let's talk about the external environment,
Mm-hmm.
which is something Ta-Nehisi talks about, of like these are environmental things that can also happen at times. He over dramatizes it at some points, in my opinion. But here's a very real thing that Kendrick is talking about, where he moves into Pimp a Butterfly, which is very much so internal. How is he now having to reconcile with all of these things? And this is him in his current moment, dealing with his mental health, dealing how he shows up with that, essentially like acknowledging he's having double consciousness throughout the entire album, of just like, this is me here, but this is me internally. How do I show up in this black space as a Black man in America in this new space? And then you get Damn, which, listening it to in reverse, now he's unpacking in Damn, and you're seeing his relationship to his mother, his relationship to his father, his relationship to his music, his relationship to the mass media, which we get up to in the very first track of Damn, where it's like Kendrick Lamar is da 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 in his new song All Right. And it's like interesting because we're literally getting everything, his entire story leading up to Pimp a Butterfly. And that moment where they were just like, oh. But at the end of that, we also see a shot. We hear a shot happen. So like, as he comes into this unpacking and realizing, and then if we're listening to the album backwards, he ends off with this wise woman, him getting shot by this blind woman walking, which is so like interesting when you put it in perspective about all of these topics that we just talked about, and that ending reality of what it means to be a Black man.
Exactly. That, and that's it was just so wild to me that all of these things, like all of these ideas came to me. Well, I've been dealing with these ideas over a long time in my own life, but just that moment of like prepping for class with this book, seeing the commercial for it, and then like leaving to go do something, and like Mad City comes on. I'm just like, wow, that was actually, that I can't believe, like all of these things are talking about the same thing. They're not that far apart. People like to think they are. I'm just like, yeah, it was quite good. It's quite
That is really dope. This was dope. This was one of my favorite conversations, easily. Because I definitely just appreciate the nuance that you brought into this conversation, but it's also like, a lot of the crux of this show is really just understanding that oftentimes when we have these conversations, it happens in an echo chamber. We're not actually on the streets, like talking about this stuff and unpacking with these people that we want to do all this high theoretical intellectual research on. So I do think it is really dope of you to be able to bridge those worlds with having empathy, with your personal experience, with pop culture, but also like this added layer of language where you're just like, no, these are very real systems that are all working at once. And sometimes I think today we tend to say, all right, this works here, this works here. How are these things now interconnected? And how does this interconnectedness work within the human? with work in the development of the Black boy and how we have to navigate these spaces, which I think like your genius is something vicious, man.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I really do enjoy bridging uh, the kind of high theory stuff, things that are formally in certain disciplines, anthropology, sociology, et cetera, with popular culture, right? That these things are not, like Afro-surrealism can be seen through these shows, through these films, right? You can talk about Afro-pessimism, you can talk about, Frantz Fanon and epidemialization, right? Like you can see all those things. They're not unrelated, right? They're talking about the Black condition, about Black life. But people have this notion that one is higher or the other is a lower form. It's like, that's incorrect. And in order to understand Blackness, I would say you need to bridge those two ideas. So.
No, that's a fact, because you made me think about like when the inspiration for my dissertation actually for college, my capstone paper was on how Black theater is inherently alienating to a non-Black audience, essentially, and everything is didactic. So there's this thing in theater where they say this is Brechtian theater, epic theater, and a tenet of that is the alienation effect, where it takes you out of the world of the play because people always want this catharsis by the end of it. But his form of theater always forces you to see, this is how this person is flying in the air. You're going to see the stage crew. You're going to see this very like jarring language that you might not fully understand. And you might be like, huh? Like, what is this? And so for me, I was in a theater watching Fences, and with these white people were just like, I mean, it was okay. But then they were comparing it to another white movie. And I was like, this is both the exact same premise, but you see this as specifically a Black thing and an insight into Blackness, but non-Black people also deal with adultery. Non-Black people deal with fatherhood. Non-Black people deal with this idea of like, I have to raise a child that is not mine.
Right. We need to expand our definition of the human.
Yes. And that's the part where I'm just like, you did what you needed to do. So yeah, no, thank you for engaging in this conversation. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And also just like challenging and pushing me. Like I'm excited to go back and rewatch BlackAF and see it with a new lens that I didn't see it with initially. Yeah, man.
It was dope. I'm glad we finally got to do this.
I don't think it'll be the last one.
It definitely won't be the last, but please, have me again. I'm happy to get on here, chop it up some more with others and you. This was dope. Thanks.
Facts on facts. Thank you, man. Are we having game night tonight?
I have no idea. I don't. Maybe I'm not sure.
All right. If it happens, I'll be there, and then I'll see you later. If not, it was nice seeing your face this morning.
It was, and we can talk about it. And then I'm sure we'll have one night where we'll just be talking about this podcast because we'll send it to them and they'll listen. Yes, it'll be a whole thing. And Tia will write about it on her blog, hopefully.
Look, that's all interconnectedness. We all got to bring each other up. All right, you good? We all love.
Exactly. All right, Marquis.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guy. Appreciate you so much.
All right.